to the committee of the whole meeting on January 12th. It's Johnsburg School District 12. Jim Barrett. Here. Jerry Harker. Here. Mel Close.
Here.
Steve Blake. Here. Megan Michael.
Here.
Gabby Nice.
Here.
Thomas. Here. Please rise for the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Hey, we have agenda time for citizens to speak. As we have said in previous board meetings, if you would like to have a comment read out loud at the meetings, you can send that comment to citizens-to-speak@johnsburg12.org by 3 o'clock on Tuesday. We have 2 submissions for this week. First is from Yulina Reedcook, and it is as follows. I'm a parent of 2 students in the district. One is in special education. Both of my children are regressing and not getting access to education or attention they need and would otherwise receive in-person learning. I reached out to teachers, principal, and superintendent. I feel disappointed with my concerns being dismissed by some or not being addressed at all. Only a handful of teachers really trying to make the best out of this situation. I'm trying to understand the reasoning in these rules, but they don't make any sense. We have child cares, restaurants, bars, and most importantly, other schools open, but our school remained closed for almost 10 months. We are well into pandemic. Virus is not novel anymore. We have safety procedures in place. It's time to take responsibility of the educators and let kids go back to school. Regards. Our second is from Nancy Thompson. Good evening. My name is Nancy Thompson, and I thank the board for reading my comment question. I am pleased that the district has done the right thing by allowing the parents to have a choice between 100% remote e-learning and hybrid. That being said, can the superintendent and the board provide an outline at the next Board of Education meeting regarding the procedures in place to return to 5 days in-person learning before the end of the school year? Thank you. Thank you for your submissions. We will now go to Annie and the finance report.
Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen for those who are on Zoom. Oh, I guess our host is the same. So I hope you guys can all follow along with your computers. I'm going to use my other screen to kind of go through my presentation. Okay. Very good. Sorry, you guys okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about our quarter-to-date finances, an update of our 5-year financial projections, and talk about operations and personnel. For our second quarter finance update, first I wanted to talk a little bit about our federal funding for this year. For this year, we have received typical federal funding. There hasn't been a whole lot of changes in terms of our title grants or our idea flow-through grants. We did receive one additional source of funding this year from the federal government, and that is in the form of the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, also known as the CARES Grant. We received our first distribution of that allocation over the summer, which was in the amount of $112,000, which we did budget for. And we use this towards expanding our technology for our students while in remote and hybrid learning. We just recently learned that we are receiving a second allocation. We're not sure exactly when we're getting that distribution and or when it's going to be finally allocated. But that dollar amount is estimated at $560,000 for District 12. And that can be used through September of 2022. Currently, we do not have that budgeted, but we will be having discussions as we find out that allocation so we can determine the best use of those funds. They are to be allocated towards mitigating learning loss through supplemental learning opportunities for our students, for closing the digital divide, much like we used it for this past year, and for addressing mental health needs for our students. So we're excited to be able to utilize those funds to bring our kids back and to get them back up to speed And that's a lot of what Terry and Fran will be talking about and obviously be working on as we move into the rest of the year. For state funding, on track with what we've been used to so far. Our funding of the evidence-based funding has still been paid as scheduled on the 10th and the 20th of each month. Our mandated categorical, the first quarter was vouchered and paid back in September. Our second quarter was vouchered in December, but we have not yet received those funds, which is pretty typical with the state. For local funding, as you know, we've been tracking our 2019 property tax payments that are due in 2020. The last distribution we received yesterday was about $48,000, bringing us up to a total of $22.5 million of that total tax revenue for the 2019 levy out of the almost $22.8 million. So total remaining to be collected is 1.2%. And we budgeted to not receive 1%, or so we're really close to our budget. We do have one more distribution coming through on January 25th, and then for this month, and then we'll have our final distribution coming in February. So we're hopeful that we'll hit that, at least what we budgeted, if not better. So I wanted to do something a little different this time because this year is so different. Typically on a quarterly basis, I give you an update of where we're at quarter to date versus budget to date. But we talked a lot about, what can we do to save funds this year and not expend unnecessarily. So I wanted to do a comparison of where we're at quarter to date for this December 31st versus 2019 December 31st. So that's what this next slide is depicting here. So if you look at where I have property tax noted, it's accrual adjusted because of the fact that we received a lot of our property tax distributions after June 30th. So it's really kind of skewed. So it would look as though we've received a lot more this year than we actually had for this fiscal year. So I adjusted that, and so you can see we're lagging just a little bit behind where we were last year. CPPR taxes are pretty spot on. We just received a distribution of that today for about $35,000. So pretty much we received most of the CPPR taxes that we budgeted for this year. Other general state aid, state grants, we're pretty in tune to where we typically are. Federal grants, you see we've received more funding this year, and that does have to do with that CARES funding. The biggest thing that we show in loss of revenue for this year is our fees. And at first that jumped out at me, and so I took a closer look and I thought, well, registration fees and kindergarten fees, but really the biggest piece of that is the loss of revenue because of food service. So we're not serving lunches, we're not collecting money for food service. So ultimately, the good news to that is we're not spending money on the opposite side either. So you can see that in terms of revenue year to date, we're about $470,000 behind where we were this time last year in revenue. But on the expenditure side, you can see that in salary and benefits, we're about $375,000 less spent this year than we did last year. And that's due to we're not using subs, we haven't had a lot of transportation food service workers, and we don't have supervision. We've reduced a lot of those expenditures and haven't had some extra duties either. Also, you'll notice that we're about $500,000 underspent compared to where we were in supplies last year. And again, that has a lot to do with our food service supplies, as well as our transportation supplies, since we haven't had to spend on fuel and repairs to buses. So overall, we're about $950,000 less spent compared to revenue for this year over last year. So obviously, we're really being mindful of things, and I wanted you guys just to be aware of that. It'll kind of show on our next slide what the impact of all of this has been. So this next slide, due in part to not only the fact that we're being conservative this year, but also because we were able to really improve on our fund balances over the last couple of years. You'll see that as of December 31st last year, we had cash available of about $4.7 million. As of December 31st this year, we had available cash of about $7.4 million, a change of about $2.6 million. So ultimately, this is good for us. It helps us in the fact that we don't know what might happen with our property taxes this next year. There may be another lag on that, so it helps to have that cash available, and also will help us to reduce our tax anticipation warrants hopefully this spring. Any questions on any of that so far?
Where would you project us to be, just off your, just as a general, I won't speak to the fire, as far as Todd's Is it like $1.1 million, $1.2 million, $1.3 million?
So right now, we're holding at about 2 million, just because we don't know what's gonna happen with property taxes. So typically, we receive our first distribution of property taxes in June, or in the very end of May for our June property taxes. We have no idea what's gonna happen this year, and if there's gonna be another extension. So we wanna play on the safe side. There's potential that we'll wanna cover a little bit into June and making sure that we have available cash. Or typically, we get that first May distribution, we felt pretty good. We're thinking we may need a little extra cash to push us into June further.
But assuming like normalized, like we didn't have to worry about that, we would be as low as like 1.1 million or something like that, right?
Easily, yes. Yes. But we also probably would have spent more this year, so I want to keep that in perspective.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Moving forward, so last time we talked about projections.
I have some questions.
Oh. I'm sorry?
I have a couple questions, this could be for both you and Dan.
Okay.
So I'm looking at the federal funding slide.
Yep.
And where they have, where we can use this, I believe it's ESSER money. So could you give us some examples? First, I'm looking at the first bullet point, mitigating learning loss through supplemental learning opportunities. What would be some examples of supplemental learning opportunities?
Well, I know that Fran and Terry have been putting a lot of time and effort into thinking about that in terms of what we can do for implementing summer programs, after-school programs. Also, what we could do to bring in additional teachers potentially, but obviously we don't necessarily want to go that route if we can't sustain that. But I know that we haven't had enough conversations, at least I haven't, where I feel comfortable speaking further to that. Dan and Terry and Fran will probably be best with that one.
It's more about tutoring and supplementing some extra pay for staff members or providing additional programs to kids and kids programs or having programs come here and all like that.
Can that be used for transportation? If you're making the case that it's needed for, like, so we have kids with after-school program, we're getting them home.
We would need to check on that, or that might be able to be included there.
No, I think the ESSER funds, and Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, fall in the same classification as title funds, and you can use title funds or transportation. So I remember when we got our first allocation, that was stated clearly, yes, we can use that funding for transportation.
Yes, that's correct. Ultimately, the ESSER funds are in line with the title funding, so basically they look at similar populations, similar qualification for that grant and making that distribution. So typically the expenditures are pretty similar. We can use it for anything from salaries to professional development to transportation to resources. So it's pretty wide array of things.
Good, because I was worried that if, we have students that we've identified in need, but they have no way to get home, that'd be unfortunate, but if it is that broad-based, how we can use those dollars, that's I appreciate that flexibility, that's good. And then I have one other, the third bullet point, could you just give us some examples of what might be addressing mental health needs of our students, what might that entail?
And can you maybe speak to that as addressing the mental health needs of our students?
It would be additional counseling and related to what most people would do, or different programs that we could bring in for mental health assistance.
Ken, I know
Go ahead, Fran.
Our social workers, have been reaching out to parents individually. There's several outside sources that have been reaching out to the schools as well. And the social workers are working pretty much more individually with parents that need any type of resources. They do join the classes as well as do their individual therapies with the students. They've met with parents as well that feel that they need some support at home to help their students be successful. We still do have Chris McCarthy from Amina Health working with us. He does meet with our students as well remotely at this point with the high school. So we've been doing as much as we can, but unfortunately most of it is remote. I know we have done some home visits. Both administrators and social workers have been doing home visits and checking in with kids as necessary as well as parents.
Thanks, Fran.
anyone anything else with those first few slides? Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Keep going, Annie.
the last time we took a big look at our 5-year financial projections was in January 2019, so 2 years ago. Hard to believe so much has changed from then till now. But there are some good things that have happened since then. If you go to the next slide, summary financial progress. For FY 18, 19, and 20, we did achieve balanced budgets in all of our operating funds and closed the 3 years with surpluses, and pretty substantial surpluses, which we talked about. And our first year was about $1.5 million, the second year $1.5 million, and this past year was about $1.9 million. It's important to know that this is on an accrual basis, and so that $1.9 million on June 30th accounted for any outstanding tax revenue that was pretty much due before June 30th that potentially didn't receive until September, as well as the outstanding state payments for categoricals that did come in until after the close of the year. So that's partially has impacted our cash flow, and obviously we can catch up with that now. But that $1.9 million wasn't necessarily a true depiction of our cash balance at that time. But regardless of it, we've been able to improve our operating fund balance by nearly $5 million over the last 3 years. So pretty significant increases just from when we did our financial projections 2 years ago. So moving forward, we've made some changes to our assumptions. The first set of assumptions are the expenditure assumptions. And with this, we kind of shot for the moon and said, okay, worst case scenario, what are we spending and where are we going? In terms of salary and benefits, which is obviously our 80% of our budget. So in terms of wages and benefits, we followed our contracts for JSSO and JTO contracts. The JSSO contract expires in one more fiscal year after FY22, and the JTO goes through another year of FY23. Beyond what's assumed for in those contracts, for the certified staff, we increased 4.5% for wages after after the contract is expired, plus language that we've assumed for in the past. And for after the JSSO contract expires, we've assumed for a $1 annual increase for all of those staff members. We've also assumed for a $1 annual increase for all non-certified staff members, which is kind of staying in line with what we're assuming for with minimum wage increases. Obviously, that's a factor that we can control, but we wanted to put everything into it so you guys had kind of the big picture with that. Also, we increased admin salaries and extra duties by 3%, which is pretty standard for what we've done in the past. We did pretty similar increases for our health insurance, like we've been doing for the JTO contract of $25 to $50 per year per month per person, which adds up really fast. For staffing, we've replaced all of our retirees and added no more retirees if we didn't know about the retirees, we didn't add in any new ones. We added in one FTE at the junior high to replace Amy Millard from last year that we did not replace this year to bring that position back when we're back in full in person. And then we also included the addition of one FTE for a library meeting specialist at the junior high, which is something we've been talking about for many years since Terry Fraser put in corporate retirement. Other expenditures we have pretty flat, minus just some things that we kind of knew were happening in terms of our liability insurance and things like that. Capital projects is kind of the wild card right now because if you recall, our goal is to do a pretty significant project in a couple of years to kind of clean up the roofs. But we kicked that can a little bit since we didn't do a project last year. So it's something to be mindful of. For now, we just have a placeholder of $100,000, and if we have the ability to do more, then we would do that within a year.
Amy,
Yes.
real quick, just a question. I remember you doing a sort of an analysis of the capital expenditures, repairs on the various buildings, and you had that. You had it pretty. Hoping you're using $100,000 and not using sort of playing with that schedule.
Ultimately right now, there's so many variables that can determine whether or not we're gonna hit these targets or not. Last year, we pushed back 1 year on doing the roofs. We know that we have a little bit more wiggle room if we have to push out an extra year or two. And I think in terms of being conservative on both sides, I wanted to be conservative with that and not say, okay, we have to do these roof projects because they're falling apart, because they're not. We know that we have a little bit of life left on them, so it's a placeholder, but knowing that if we decide we want to move on, we do still have that contingency of $325,000 built in any given year.
So I can't remember what you had originally sort of mapped out. Was it much more than 4.25 per year?
No, absolutely not. But there was 1 year, which is now probably 2 years from now, I wouldn't say more than 4.25 in any given year.
Can I jump in for a minute? Just to remind us, and those who are viewing at home, like, we had to go for that referendum because we kicked cans down the road and we said, this board has it, we've got to be disciplined. So we need to be disciplined with this plan that we have so suddenly we don't get hit and we've got massive expenditures we have to come up with and we don't. So I'm just saying that 'cause I don't want to keep kicking it and find ourselves where we were just a number of years ago. We had to go to the referendum. So please keep that in mind. It may seem appealing to kick some cans down the road, but it may come back to bite us, and I don't want to have that again. A case many of us made for this referendum was
Totally agree.
we're going to be disciplined. We're not going to be in this position again. So let's please keep that in mind.
And just to,
Yes.
and just an FYI to the board, we have a lot of preliminary numbers to be able to add to it, so we completely agree, having experienced that ourselves, so we fully are aware that we have no intention of kicking the can down the road with those 10 documents, so.
No, I actually think that I brought that term up. The only reason I think I have to say that is because we did it just for 1 year based on the circumstances of COVID. We have no intention of delaying the project any further. In fact, we anticipate bringing to you a recommendation to go out to bid for the roof project at the February 4 meeting. So I'm hopeful that you guys are aware that we have no intentions of doing that. So the placeholders are just, ultimately based upon the fact that there's a lot of conservative estimates here. So for the time being, we just put it at 100,000, but obviously knowing the numbers, we should have no problem being able to move forward with those projects. So we'll bring more information at the next meeting about operations, so just so you know.
Keep going.
Okay? Should I move
Yep,
forward?
keep going, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so, moving forward, I did, put together 2 scenarios based on 2 different revenue assumptions. The expenditures are held flat between both of the scenarios. The first revenue assumption, maintains local funding, at a pretty conservative level. As you know, our CPI for this past December was 2.3%, and new growth was 1.6 million. We're estimating on this projection, and the second projection, only a consumer price index of 1%. That number gets released very soon. If I could push this meeting back, I would have, because it's just a pretty important part of what these projections are based on. But ultimately, we felt that 1% was really conservative. We, in conversations with PMA, estimate that that's going to be higher for sure. And then after that, we held it at 1.2% for each year following. In our projections prior to this set of projections, we used 1.5% annually. For state funding, the biggest thing that we're doing here is we reduced all state revenue, including our evidence-based funding, by 10%. And then maintain that flat from FY22 through FY25. So if you take a look at that, that's us losing about $450,000 to $500,000 in revenue every year if the state makes that kind of a cut. So that's a huge cut to our budget. So I just want you to know, I think that's kind of a worst case scenario in conversations with PMA. They think that there may be some reductions to the categoricals. But in terms of the evidence-based funding, since we're tier 2, we're likely to hold steady with where we're currently at with our funding, but not to see a reduction. If anything, it will reduce between tier 3 and tier 4 schools, but I still wanted you guys to see this projection just so that you can see what it would look like if we did those 10% of all our state funding. So moving to the next slide, you can see, as of right now, we have a fund balance of about $5.7 million across our operating funds. Over the next couple of years, you'll see that with this kind of a projection, we do, obviously, our expenditures exceed our revenue by 10 bit. But all in all, if we weren't to use that contingency, we would still gain over where we're at today. So ultimately, given the projections of expenditures and even, putting money into doing these capital projects, even if we spend all of our contingency on our capital projects, we end up about where we're at today. With what I call a pretty bad projection. So that would be the state really slashing and dashing our funding. In scenario 2, we use the same source of projections, with the exception of we have evidence-based funding flat, as we are a tier 2 district, and we maintain that flat from FY 22 through FY 25. The rest of the projections were maintained at the same level. And as you can see with this, even with the 10% reduction in the rest of the state funding and very minimal increases for our property taxes, at the end of the day, we're still in a pretty good place. After 1 to 2 years, we're likely to hit 25% of fund balance to revenue ratio, which is one of our targets, as well as likely to eliminate tax anticipation warrants. But the thing to keep an eye on is at the end of 5 years, we start to get really tight. So if these projections hold and the state does cut as much, we'll have to take a closer look as we get into year 3 and 4. But ultimately, based on these projections, we look pretty confident in where we're at today. Does anyone have any questions about that?
Georgia helped. The Senate race in Georgia.
Oh. Let's see. I just have a comment that I think is worth all of us remembering, and I think it illustrates the challenges we have as a school district to do what we're doing. To me, the number that jumps out in these 2-year slides, local funding provides 80% of our revenue. And as we know, the Constitution of the state of Illinois says a majority, which would be at a minimum 50.1%, should come from the state. And our state is providing us 72% of our revenue. And that's why our property taxes are high, you guys. We start, if you take what we abate and the shortfall from the state, we're starting about $8.5 million in the hole every year for revenue. So it's yes. Well, we did as a board say we would abate those farm taxes, so that's us. I guess we could have ignored what our predecessors said, but that's not how we operate here. But through that all, to quote my friend Mr. Barrett, we provide a very good education for our kids. And we have been able to, and I don't want people to be deceived like, oh, they got those huge surpluses every year. They're really not surpluses, they're paying down debt that we have. We're still borrowing money every year. Eventually, we will be able to stop doing that and we can start achieving the goals, additional goals that we have for our district financially. But please be aware of what kind of obstacles we're facing, Dan and Annie, every year when they put together a budget. It's a challenge and they do a good job. And so I commend them, and also want to commend ourselves for being focused on that. That's again why I brought up we got to stay focused on the capital improvements too. We can't be so focused on driving down what we owe that we hurt the district in the future. That's all I want to say.
Well, not to mention too, though, Tom, given the fact that we're basically looking at a break even at best in these scenarios, and that's not what a district should be running at, because I can't remember the exact number, but Dan or maybe somebody else might remember, but what is recommended to have, how many months of cash on hand to operate the school district?
Minimum 3 should be 6.
6 months, a minimum of that. So a minimum of 6 months, which is, we'll just say relatively half of our budget, even though there is some ebb and flow to that as the year goes on, should be sitting in a bank account, willing and ready to be used if necessary. And we're still at a point where we're paying off debts from it.
Right.
So, now that we finally think, and Annie and Dan, you guys have done a tremendous job, helping us get back to this point, but now to see some of these shortfalls that our state might have on a go-forward basis, right when we get to the point where we're starting to tread some water and look in a good position to maybe build up that excess cash that we should have on reserve, may not happen as quickly as we want it to. So I think we do need to be very conservative as we go through. Thank you.
Good point, Mr. Barrett. Anyone else? Okay, Annie, back to you.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the financial projections, we're going to talk a little bit about operations. In the end, we're going to start it off with our public school calendar.
Yay! Yeah, included in your information is our draft of our calendar for the 21-22 school year. We have first day of kids on the 24th of August, with the last day of kids on the 2nd of June. We're matching pretty closely to the county schools. Our holiday break matches Tech Campus, which is always nice to be able to get our kids matched up over there. I just want to caution the board that we will bring this to approval at the next board meeting, but I do want to caution the board, there's always rumblings, especially with COVID right now, of changes in legislation on extending the calendar. And there was just recent legislation that was withdrawn about extending the calendar for 15 days. But in the legislation, it said that there would be no additional compensation for teachers or staff in order to do that. Now, that got pulled off the table during the lame duck session, but that doesn't mean that that conversation may not continue in the spring. I would, of course, keep the board fully informed on that. I have not heard any additional rumblings on that particular piece of legislation on that calendar, but it wouldn't shock me if something happens with the calendar of adding days or something along that line. Maybe not for next year, but in the future. So I'll keep you posted. So this is, we have to make changes to it, I'll keep you posted, but this would be at the next board meeting for approval, unless the board has any questions. And then we'll just keep going and talk about COVID information. So our plan is to continue to come back on the 21st, unless the board has any objections to that. I don't see any objections to that. So we'll go ahead and keep rolling with that. We're monitoring the different data that's out there, whether it's the county information, the state information, the local zip code information, making sure, see if we can see any spikes or anything like that. Right now, everything looks like there's no spikes taking place. We review and provide information forward in regards to our mitigation strategies. We feel very strongly that those are good to go and are very solid for our staff and our students. I do want to take this opportunity to thank our principals, our assistant principals, and our district administrative team for getting all of that put together. That was, it's been quite a task, and I just want to make sure we thank them. Just for the board's information, we have, it was interesting in watching phone calls or emails come to offices in regards to how parents felt. We actually had more families switch to remote learning than hybrid. And so that was an interesting trend. But we keep working with the health department as it relates to both this information and you probably have seen the press release in regards to the vaccines. They started to sign up information now for educators who want to be. I'm working very closely with the county health department and the county administrator out there as it relates to the rollout of the vaccine, get that information out to our teachers. No timeline has been provided to us as of yet, but we'll continue to stay on that. So we're excited. Can't wait to get some kids back on the 21st and the 22nd. But we feel very strongly that our mitigation strategies are good to go and start making plans. So does anybody have any questions with any of that? All right. Fantastic. Annie, you want to talk about transportation?
Sure, just a couple more slides. In terms of transportation, you may or may not see the information that came out from Tom Schwartz in relation to the changes that were made with routes. Pretty great information. We went from about 25% of students riding the same bus to and from school up to 95%. So really reducing the crossing of those cohorts and keeping the same kids on the same buses and the same seats. It's just another way to obviously handle student management, to obviously reduce some of the exposures, and to obviously help with contact tracing. So we thought that was pretty awesome. It was a lot of work done by him and Sandy and Jolene and the office, but they got it done, so we're pretty excited about that.
Yeah, good stuff from Tom.
Just a couple of little things for personnel. Another thing that we've been working on, if you recall, in the fall, we did place one substitute in a daily sub position in each of our buildings. We've now brought that up to 2 because we know how much substitutes are in demand. So we've managed to grab 2 per building that will be on schedule to start the day every day, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. And it'll be the same substitutes, so we'll get used to working for the same staff members and getting comfortable in those buildings and having, obviously, a little bit now of knowledge of what's going on in those buildings. So we're excited about that. A little note as it relates to unemployment, I'm sure some of you have been affected by this or are knowledgeable about it. But in terms of unemployment, well, two parts of this. The first one I'm going to talk about is our fraudulent claims. We've had probably about 30 fraudulent claims for staff members in the district. We've communicated really effectively with them to let them know we've got out ahead of things and obviously work with IDES to try to reduce some of that fraud, but it's everywhere. So if you guys didn't know about it, please be aware. It's everywhere. And then the other thing is obviously we have the unemployment.
I'm sorry, maybe for anybody who's listening from the village here, maybe explain just a brief little synopsis of what that fraud is. It almost feels like there's people within our district committing fraud.
Which is not true.
It's not true. So.
No, absolutely not. So what's happened is it's actually nationwide, and they hadn't really buttoned it down as to who exactly it was, whether it was internal with IDES or unemployment or IRS or anything, but ultimately it is nationwide, and somehow people have found a way to target unemployment because of the fact that there's so much unemployment happening right now, and because so many rules have changed with unemployment. In the past, our support staff members who were seasonal did not qualify for unemployment, and now they do. So just in this year alone, we've probably had 300 unemployment claims, and a typical year we have 1 or 2. And along the way, someone found a way to decide, oh, this is a good way to scam the system, got a hold of names and social security numbers, potentially from old breaches in systems from years ago, held on to that data and found the perfect way to use it. So it is not an internal thing, it's happening all over the place in other businesses and other companies. And
Essentially, identity theft for unemployment.
it is basically identity theft for unemployment, and all it really takes is a name and social security number. Yeah. So, needless to say, the way that we've tried to stop that is any unemployment claim that we receive in our office, we instantly contact that employee, whether they're our employee, a substitute, or past employee, and let them know that this claim has been made. And just clarify whether it's an accurate claim, and if it isn't, we instantly alert Equifax to let them know that it's wrong. So.
Thank you.
Sure, but for non-charge, for those staff members who did qualify for unemployment, really, because we didn't get our place to the end of the school year, so from the summer through the end of December, actually only through September, we had $135,000 worth of charges in unemployment that we will not have to pay as a district. That is a federally covered amount of funds, and that went through the end of December. For charges starting in January, if we do have any others, we will have to pay for a portion of that moving forward. But that was another benefit by the federal government that saved us a good amount of money. And last but not least, I just wanted to mention the FFCRA, which is the Families First Coronavirus Response Act that was implemented last year and extended through December 31st for leaves of absence related to sick leave related to coronavirus, as well as FMLA for child care reasons. That did expire. The mandate ended on December 31st, so we no longer have to implement that, but we can voluntarily. Just wanted to note that it's very unlikely that we will utilize this, as obviously we need to maintain staffing levels, but it is something that we can. If for some reason we find that someone's out sick and has to be off, we could continue to pay them and take that tax credit from March 31st. We don't anticipate doing that, however. So that was all that I had.
Thanks, Annie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Terry and Fran?
instruction plan. The page comes up there for you. And last time I listed some goals and actions that we're going to take to aid the recovery of learning loss. And I kind of divided it up by tier 1, tier 2, and then some of those supplemental instructional programs that were mentioned earlier. So I'm going to talk about tier 1 and tier 2, 3, then Fran's going to jump in and help me talk about the after-school, before-school programs and some school. So in terms of tier 1 instruction, if you don't, just to remind you, tier 1 is things that are happening in the classroom, so that's regular classroom instruction. I did, as in the document, put that professional development that's listed there on the district public choice menu, and in fact, yesterday, I put the map data analysis training on there. It's actually on there as a student goal setting. I've been attending MTSS. By the way, MTSS used to be known as RTI, but MTSS, a little different focus of helping kids be successful in tier 1 rather than a pathway to special ed, for lack of a better term. So I've been attending those MTSS meetings at Ringwood and just to give them some guidance when they need to, or when they need the guidance and they have questions, so those have been very useful. Especially as soon as we get our winter benchmarking data back, I'm going to provide guidance to those teams regarding, well, how do we use this data to help kids, especially the kids that are showing health gaps. Now attending all the grade level team meetings except for 5th grade, we're still working on the Zoom link, but we need to provide guidance on instructional practices. Those have been very, very useful, asking me questions, and really, I think it's really been nice to support them in that way. Reviewed DF lists at the junior high and high school. We looked at that data and we actually planned for changes in what we call the MTSS structure. We finalized some plans that we're going to put in place yesterday, as a matter of fact. We're basically going to create a separate team just to look at tier 2 and tier 3. I'm sorry for your question?
No, I cleared his throat.
Sorry.
No, Jim just cleared his throat, Terry.
Okay. Just finalizing those plans, we're going to make a separate team to look at student data and figure out like how can we really get interventions for kids, especially the kids that are struggling. So that was tier 1 for tier 2 and tier 3. By the way, I'm skipping ahead on slide 6 for those of you following along. What we did for that is we put together a monitoring system for those of you who purchased interventions that I mentioned last time, Jolly Phonics, Dreambox Math, Explode the Code, it's up there, but we've had that for a while. We've been looking at progress monitoring data. We've been looking at specific intervention data. What I mean by that is like Explode the Code has its own dashboard. I can get in there and see how students are progressing in that particular program. Keeping in mind that each program has its own metrics, so I really rely more on the aims of the progress monitoring data. Also, what wasn't being done in the past that I just kind of started requiring being done is putting that progress management data in the aims of the system along with any notes, intervention changes. That's useful for making decisions instructionally and intervention-wise about those students, but it's also useful if that student is eventually going to be referred for special ed services. Fran and her team need all the data. In fact, statutorily need some of that data. So we started using that system and putting that in. And I've been actually working with interventionists at Ringwood and their MTSS team to really take a look at some of the processes in that team, looking at intervention effectiveness and really working on matching student need to the proper intervention. Now that we have more interventions available for them to use. The thing about interventions is it's more like a toolkit because different kids are going to have different needs and they need more tools to draw from. So we're going to start, and Fran can jump in when needed. We're going to talk about potential after-school or before-school programs, depending on what building we're talking about. And again, I want to emphasize all planning at this time is still tentative. We need our winter benchmarking data to kind of figure out the final numbers and the final budget. But Fran and I sat down. We determined a few things about any before after-school program. We're going to take a comprehensive look at what the student needs are. We don't want to implement a program just to implement a program. We want to implement a program that's targeted to what our kids need, and that's where that data, winter benchmarking data is really important. Students currently receiving tier 2 or tier 3 that aren't meeting, we call the exit criteria, in other words, they're still showing learning loss, will definitely be eligible, so we're not going to exclude them from the scheduled program. We're looking at just how the building's schedules are structured, K-5 programs, after schools, 6-12, after school. For the high school, maybe look at some of that 0 hour for specific interventions. As far as funding goes, I have ample Title I funding. This is the time of year where we actually receive what we call carryover, what wasn't spent last year, and any money that they have that other schools didn't use. So I have plenty of funding right now to pay for staff, prep time, and transportation. With the exact budget, we still need the numbers for the kids, and then between staffing numbers. So again, more logistical planning. Brand, do you have anything to add before I just kind of plug?
I'm just trying to clarify that this would also be in addition to the interventions that, these kids are getting during the school day. So this is not to replace anything that they are currently getting, this is in addition to. And again, the map data is that starting point for us to really kind of get the numbers, take a look at what the deficit areas are, and we group them, matching the teacher that has that strategy and knowledge for their deficit area would be the next step. And then kind of carving out with the building principles, time, space, and all of that.
So that's for before and after school programs. So as far as potential summer school, we did have a little experience. Brent and I were planning a summer school last year. Yeah, so I'm like, okay, we kind of know what we need to do for this. So again, we had a planning meeting. Again, we're using winter benchmarking to determine those before and after school program participation numbers. But then we're going to use the spring to determine further student need. Who else, we're still not progressing, we need summer school. Again, students currently, thank you for emphasizing that, students currently receiving the services and spring benchmarking, they're still not making progress or enough progress, they're going to be eligible. And any students that really qualify. Again, we have MTSS criteria in the MTSS handbook. To use title funding for this, you have to have identifying criteria. Now what that is, we have to determine what that is, but there has to be identifying criteria. So that's what we'll be using, are the entrance and exit criteria. Again, funding from Title I's, a lot of schools do a summer program, so this is not new for Title I funding. And again, the exact budget is to be determined. Again, still planning and still need some spring. But know that it's definitely. Anybody have any questions? Or Fran, do you have anything to add, I guess?
Once you get that spring program kind of up and running off the ground, I think the summer one will just kind of flow a bit easier from that. And Social Ed's done summer school programming for years, so we'll bring on the rest of that one.
And the nice thing about you with special ed summer school, I think last year it worked out that I could just piggyback on your transportation funding to get my kids to where they needed to go. So between the two of us, we have the funds to do that. That's all I have for you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jerry, what should you know about policy?
I am totally up to speed on everything you want to know about the changes.
And we're all good then? Everything's fine?
It's fine.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you, Jerry, for that report.
Questions for Jerry?
What was that?
Any questions for Jerry? We're just asking if the board has any questions for you.
So you're surprised, Jerry, there are no questions at this time.
I'm glad there aren't any questions.
Good work, Jared. Other business? We have a meeting 2 weeks from today, right here, Board of Ed meeting. And probably the same things will be still in,
We probably will, yep. I bet it will still be in
until
this.
further notice, it'll be here and we'll be broadcasting. And if you have things you want to let us know, you can send that to your citizens to speak at johnsburg12.org. Anyone needs to say before we adjourn?
Make a motion to adjourn?
Everybody?
Thank you, guys.